You know, a part of fantasy is to believe in fairy tales. And one of the standard endings of fairy tales is, and they live happily ever after. So that was this great fantasy, a part of the assimilationist fantasy that said, you know, once we integrate with white folk, and once we go to school with them, and once we break down the barriers to employment and all this other kind of stuff, we will live happily ever after. And yet, you know, history did not justify this belief at all. As I've said on many occasions, people progress in history, but they also what? Regress. All of this happens in history. People may integrate in history, but they also do what? Disintegrate in history as well. Black Americans believe in the American idea of progress, that things must necessarily get better than they were before. Who told you that lie? There is no law in the universe that promises any individual or any people that things necessarily get better than they were before. We've seen nations and peoples and civilizations do what? Rise, mature, and what? Fall. We've seen literally races and ethnic groups disappear from the face of this earth. We can witness on this very continent the near decimation of the Native American. We can look at our own history, the history of the Reconstruction era, the history of the 1870s and 1880s, when blacks could vote, when blacks were elected to Senate, when blacks were elected to Congress, when blacks were parts of state legislatures, when blacks were sheriffs, when blacks headed corporations, when blacks had strong civil rights legislation. And yet, all of this was taken from us, and it took literally 100 years for black people to get the same thing back. If the law says that progress is the only thing that happened in the world, then we should not have been struggling for voting rights in the 1960s, because we had them in the 1870s. You see? We should not have been struggling for civil rights and the other things in the 1960s and 70s. We had them in the late 1860s and 70s. So our own history refutes the idea then that people live happily ever after, and that once they achieve a particular status and position in society, they are destined to maintain this position and only to go higher. We failed to learn a lesson then, as we are failing to learn the lesson now. We failed to learn the fact that laws do not protect anyone. That laws are not sacred. That laws are merely rules laid down by people who are strong enough to enforce them. And they're laid down to maintain their interests as a people against other people. And that they will make and unmake laws when it suits their interest to do so. And yet we have a bunch of black people who sit around here thinking that because they have civil rights laws on the books, because the Supreme Court ruled in their favor at one point, because they have some other kinds of human rights organizations, that they now are protected. The law is no stronger than its enforcement. And when the enforcement of the law is left in the hands of other people, then those people, when they choose not to enforce the law, can jeopardize us as a people. Or when they choose, can reverse the law. Look at this, what is happening today with the New York Post. At one point, Murdoch is told that he has to sell the New York Post because it is against the law for a person to own two major communications media in the same market. He could not own Channel 5 and be a major person in the Fox network and own the New York Post simultaneously. He had to let one go, so he let the Post go. And now what do we hear? The very governor himself and other people who even made the law now saying that they will do what? Sweep the law aside. Why? Because it is in their interest to do so. Because they need that scandal sheet and that rag to continue to degrade African American people. They need it during the next election campaign because it does the dirty work of the New York media as a whole. So while the New York Times can pretend that it is above the fray and that it is objective, and while the Daily News can dance around, they will let the Post say all the dirty things that they dare not say. But they're all in cahoots against the empowerment of African people. And we have not learned the lesson yet, that the only thing that ultimately protects the people and protects the interests of the people is that they have the power to protect themselves and to defend themselves against the incursions of their enemies. They cannot protect themselves by depending upon the laws made by their enemies and laws enforced by their enemies. We did not learn that lesson during the 1860s, 70s, and 80s. And it appears that we have not learned that lesson during the 1960s, 70s, and 80s. And therefore, we are vulnerable to suffer the same setbacks. And as a matter of fact, we may suffer even worse setbacks in the future. We must be aware then of what our reality is and look upon our history as a check against our fantasies. The placing of blacks in these high positions will no more provide for the advancement of African people. It's a major situation, by the way, and very typical of bourgeois rule. To get the average person and to get the masses to believe that their own individual advancement represents an advancement for the race. Yeah. So their promotion to particular positions means, ain't we moved forward in the world? And yet I ask people basic questions. How many nickels have the advancement of many of our bourgeois people put in your pocket? How much has the average black man and woman and the quality of life for the masses of African people been improved by the movement of one black person or 10 black persons from one good job to another? We are supposed somehow to live through these people vicariously while we starve on these streets and we go unsalaried and unemployed. And we are to believe then that the advancement of some few of us represents the advancement of the rest of us. But let's check this fantasy against reality. And we can almost see a direct relationship between the number of black elected officials and the suffering of African people. As I pointed out before, we've lamented the death of Thurgood Marshall, but I find it interesting that he got more out of the Supreme Court while he was a lawyer than when he was a justice sitting on the bench. In fact, it is sort of interesting that he sat on the bench only to watch many of his achievements rolled back by that court before which he practiced. We got a black man who was the Secretary of Health, only to see the black community be devastated by drugs and tuberculosis and AIDS and other kinds of diseases. We got a black man who became the Secretary of Housing, and at the very point he sat in the seat, homelessness plagued and devastated the black community. We see men and women sitting on our courts around the world, and we see men and women who are district attorneys in our county courthouses And at the point where we see an increase in the district attorneys, the black district attorneys in our courthouses, we see more black men doing what? Going to jail. And as we sit more judges on the benches in various courts, we see the prisons being overrun with black men. Where is this promise then that sitting our black bourgeoisie on the courts of these cities and counties, that putting our black bourgeoisie on the seats of the U.S. Supreme Court would somehow reduce the nature of crime in our communities? We must wake up to reality.